The lecture that follows is an attempt to go in a little more depth than our textbook does into the beginning of the Bible, the beginning book of the Bible, Genesis, and the beginning of that book. So this is a more detailed focus on some of the major wording, themes, and events as recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 1 through 11. We will do these kind of in-depth looks at some particular stories or chapters from time to time, step away from the textbook to either repeat that which was briefly and superficially addressed in the textbook, and we will try to give them a little more context than what the textbook allows. The book of Genesis is a book of many types of beginnings. It's the beginning of the universe as we know it. It's the beginning of man or mankind as such. It is the beginning of the story of God's relationship with man, of the redemptive story of God and his people. Redemptive means in the sense of how God fixed which man broke. It is the book in which great doctrines, great theological statements appear, such as, for example, the person of God and his greatness, his power, his sovereignty. It is also a book in which clearly from the very beginning, the fact that mankind, when we use that man term, we mean mankind, is very unique. It's different. Genesis addresses the uniqueness of man from the very beginning of his presence in the world and in the universe. It is the book in which sin is introduced, missing the mark, going off cue tragically, a departure from the original plan. That concept, the reality of sin, it's the book of beginnings of sin. And it's also, however, the book of where the concept of covenant and promises, you see these appear immediately in the beginning story of mankind and God. Truly, the book of Genesis is truly unique. While there are other pieces of literature in ancient cultures that address beginnings and things like that, truly the book of Genesis has nothing that can compare to it, not just from a literary point of view, but more importantly from a descriptive point of view. It is truly unique. It is the book of Genesis truly represents the underpinnings, that which um, uh, props up the rest of the Bible, gives a theme to the rest of the Bible. It's a literary and theological underpinning of the rest of what we call Scripture with a capital S, which of course means the holy writings or the divine inspired writings of God. The place of Genesis, the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, is the first 38 chapters of the book of Genesis are a remarkable picture of the ancient world because they reflect a great deal of what we know from other non-inspired secular sources from the areas of Mesopotamia that describe life and culture and history. There are, in the book of Genesis, the 38 chapters in particular, not only the story of the creation, not only genealogies, listings of names of patriarchs and those who came after them, but also a story about a great flood. There are geographical terms and rivers. There's map making, excuse me. There are construction techniques described, migrations of people, the sale and purchase of land in ancient cultures, the description of legal customs and procedures. There's, of course, in-depth presence of the important way of making a living, sheep herding of ancient times, cattle raising as well. So these chapters contain all kinds of references to practices of the ancient cultures. The word Eden, which is man's first home, according to the Bible, is in a specific place in the world. It's not a mythological place. As I made reference to before in chapter 2 and verse 10, there are four waterways or groups of waterways that block in Eden, and Tigris and Euphrates are mentioned as one side of the Garden of Eden, and of course Tigris and Euphrates are in Mesopotamia to this day. And by the way, Abraham, when we get to him, or Abram, is born in a real city whose ruins can be found in the tip end of Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq today, in the city of Ur. And the Tower of Babel is most likely to be placed right around this ancient city of Babylon. There are, as I mentioned before, close ancient literary parallels to the Genesis account. The ones that could be most interesting are the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic. I'm not going to make too much reference to them, but those are two that if you become interested in looking up, that have echoes and parallels of the way Genesis describes things. But again, they are not protected from error, so you will find not only Mesopotamian gods, divinities, but also made-up narratives. There are another interesting parallels in the Mahdi letters because they show similar names, like the patriarchs that we find in Genesis. There are similar names that pop up in the Mahdi letters, and of course the references to travel, the freedom of travel in ancient times of these nomadic sheep-herding patriarchs of ancient times. Who wrote Genesis, and not only Genesis, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament? Well, no author is mentioned in the book, but traditionally the first 5 books, the Torah or the Pentateuch, are traditionally attributed to Moses. Moses being a figure that lived in the 2nd millennium before Christ, wasn't there for the creation events, but got them by inspiration and wrote them down. There may be some editorial updating, some changes made that may be present in 2 or 3 of the chapters, but there is external evidence. There is evidence that it was written by one man because there are significant linguistic similarities, meaning that there seems to be one mind, one author, one type of language being used. And by the way, in the rest of the Old Testament, Moses is referred to as the writer of Genesis and the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, and the New Testament as well confirms Moses as the writer of those first 5 books of the Old Testament and of the Bible. Jewish commentaries and writings of rabbis following the time of Moses, works collected in what's called the Mishnah or the Talmud, again echo Moses as being the writer of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are also secular historians, Jewish historians like Philo, Josephus, 1st century AD, that believe it. There are a few modern day scholars that's referred to as the documentary hypothesis. I'll just make a quick passing comment that there are some dissenting theologians today that dissent with ancient plethora, a slew of ancient sources that say one man wrote it. The documentary hypothesis is the way in which that dissenting voice that says there are 4 different sources or authors that were put together later. That's called the documentary hypothesis, but I find it severely wanting and will not spend time on that. Moses is actually an Egyptian name. It means draw out. Of course, that is an interesting parallel to what we know about and will remember about the story of Moses and his birth. He is a Levite, one of the tribes of Jews called a Levite. We know his parents, Amram and Jochebed. He has an older sister by the name of Miriam and an older brother by the name of Aaron. And he will grow up at the most exclusive, highly cultured, sophisticated, and rich palace of the second millennium before Christ, that is, at the palace of the Pharaoh in Egypt. He has a high degree of education and is also a prince of Egypt. That's who we will know Moses to be because his upbringing, at least the first 40 years of his life. When did Moses live and therefore write Genesis and the other four books of the Pentateuch? Well, there are two alternatives we must look at now. The first one is the 15th century before Christ, and it is suggested by a verse in the book of First Kings in which it refers to the 480th year from the year 966, which places us right in the middle of the 15th century as to when the wanderings in the desert start with Moses leading the people out of Egypt. So the first most probable century to place Moses is 15th century BC. I will mention the second option, which is what some go with, 13th century BC, because there are a couple of names referenced in the biblical narrative, Moses III and Ramses, and these do find an echo in Egyptian culture, and some tend to believe in the option number 2, 13th century before Christ. But your instructor tends to go with number 1. Where did he write these 5 books? Well, clearly one chapter and verse in the book of Exodus makes reference to Mount Sinai, where Moses went often to meet with God. There is, however, a possibility that other parts of those books were written along the road while in the wanderings in the wilderness. The purpose of writing things down that Moses had is very clear. As Egypt, the Hebrew people are wandering in the desert and heading towards the promised land, to write out a history of the origins of the nation of the Hebrew people from Abraham, but also, as he does by inspiration from God, also the origins of everything, including the universe, the world, and man as a creation of God. So here is a quick look at the main subjects of the book of Genesis in its 50 chapters as we have it divided now. I'll remind you that chapters and verses were not in the original text, but placed later by translators for our convenience, that is, for us to be able to reference a certain verse, a certain place. So the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis deal with the big stories, creation and the fall, and then from chapters 2 through 5, and then on to the end, we have the stories of Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, Abraham to Isaac, and then the big stories, a lot of space spent on the patriarchs Jacob and then the patriarch Joseph in Egypt. So we are in this quick look only going to get to chapter 11, so get right to when Abraham is introduced, and then we'll pick up after test 1 with that. The book of Genesis addresses, as I said previously, big topics, controversial topics, major experiences, human experiences. The first murder, capital punishment. The issue of gender roles comes up very much, and from the beginning, of course, marriage. The issue of man's relationship with the environment are embedded in how the story is told and what happened from the very beginning. There are the big issues with unfortunate choices of man and what man should have done. Honesty versus deceit. Sin and then redemption. Blessings from God and then cursings as well. So you could say opposites appear in very important life affirming or death affirming options here right from the beginning. Promises of God and also the way in which God provides. But there are also interesting references to how man develops talents, abilities, arts, crafts, the various industries of men, music making, and many others appear in the book of Genesis as well. The book of beginnings is a book of course, of relationships. God and his relationship to nature, God and man to man. So three important types of relationships are addressed from the very beginning. Genesis is unique in so many ways, but of course the first and foremost one, as it reflects ancient culture. If you talk about when Moses wrote these down 3,500 years ago, well then monotheism is of course a major item that makes Genesis stand out alone, while every other people around him in Egypt and beyond are polytheistic. Genesis, from the very first words, very first chapter, very first verse, is unabashedly, unequivocally monotheistic. There is one God. And therefore, it's inherently, from the very beginning, goes against the grain of polytheism, which means many gods, atheism, there is no God, or pantheism, God is in everything, nature is God. That is not the way. God is in everything because he created everything, but nature is not God, pantheism. So Genesis is very unique in this respect. And what it paints from the very beginning is that God freely, that has no constraints, exercises his freedom to overturn human customs. When man starts doing things, God puts a stop to it. To overturn human traditions and plans. And it also shows how God makes one-sided deals. That is a covenant where God steps in and says, this is how it's going to be between me and you. And he also, from the very beginning, defines faith. We'll see that when we get to his relationship with Abraham, how God in his covenant with him defines what faith in him is going to mean. A few other items about literary features of the book of Genesis. There are actually 10 major sections in the book of Genesis that each begin with the word account or generations. There are two major ones. There's the primeval period, chapters 1 through 11, that we're looking at in this lecture. And then as we turn to chapter 2 and beyond, in your textbook, we're going to be looking at patriarchal history, which is from chapter 11 through 50. What's interesting about the term patriarchal that we've just encountered is that the Jews later on will think of all of time, in a sense, in terms of 3 chapters. It's like the book of time has 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is the time of the patriarchs, patriarchal. Chapter 2 is the time of Moses, Mosaic. And then chapter 3, in the last chapter of all of time, is the is the Messianic chapter. So time has 3 chapters in the view of the Hebrew people. Patriarchal, Mosaic, and the last chapter is Messianic. And once the Messianic arrives, when the Messianic age is completed, that's the end of time. All of history in 3 chapters. There is also an emphasis among the literary features of Genesis on the later son in preference to the firstborn, which is kind of interesting. People are not the product of human development, but of God's sovereign intrusion. God intrudes into the plans. I've already referenced the fact that there are all kinds of echoes and repeats of importance of numbers. Number 7 from the very beginning, 10, 12, 40, that are used quite frequently, and one that is implied from the very beginning, which is 3. Important numbers, numerology in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is written in prose as opposed to poetry. It is narrative, it's a story. It's punctuated, however, from time to time with brief poems. In particular, there is one right at the end of the book of Genesis. Many subjects, many themes in the first 6 chapters, and that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time there looking at that. And what's interesting is if you make a comparison between the first 3 chapters, as we call them, of the Bible, book of Genesis, and compare them to the last 3 chapters of the last book of the Bible, Revelation, there are many subjects and themes that are highly significant, which, again, is staggering because, of course, the book of Genesis was written by Moses in 1500 before Christ, while the book of Revelation was written by John 16 centuries later. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how it begins. And the assumptions, as soon as you read that verse 1, is, first of all, God is. He is eternal. He's before the beginning. He's a personal God. He's transcendent. He's above everything. And he's immanent. He's present and concerned with everything. And by the way, something that you'll see later as you read in it is that there are other spiritual beings that exist. They're created beings, angels, and their creation is not referenced here when the story ends. There is a lot today in our contemporary society in the news. It's assumed, it's given, ancient creatures like dinosaurs and numbers that are thrown out as if proven or evidenced. In particular, you'll hear quite often, not only in the movies, but even in the newscasts, the reference to 65 million years when dinosaurs used to exist. So a quick note on that to encourage you to give it some study and not take things for granted. Is there a space between man and dinosaurs of 65 million years? Here's a quick view of your instructor that is very skeptic, not only of these numbers, but as you consider the book of Genesis as inspired or protected from error by God, well, the language itself seems to point out that no, you can't take the book of Genesis and read things into it that modern man wants to assume in his view of what happened at the beginning of time, universe, and mankind. You see, the grammar, the Hebrew grammar, does not allow for a big gap in time like 65 million years. The word that is used in the original language, yom, for day, the days of creation, is most probably to be read in a literal way, a 24-hour day. Now, as soon as I say that, of course, how can you have a day when you don't have yet the sun and the moon, which are going to be created in the 4th? How can you have a 24-hour day before? Here again, we find ourselves leading arguments that are beyond our pay grade, so to speak. When day, the word yom, is preceded in the Hebrew text by the word first, second, third, fourth, it is usually a 24-hour period. And because of that, it needs to be read in those terms. When the term's evening, it was evening and it was morning, usually it's to be read in a literal sense. There also is another just common sense factor. Vegetation is created in the fourth before animals who need vegetation to survive is created. And if there's a massive gap and there's epochal darkness, massive gap between these days, well, vegetation would have survived in an epochal darkness without sun and moon. So just a quick invitation for you to study up on this and not take anyone's word for it. But if God is God, he can create all these things and, in a sense, have them evolve within a 24-hour period. And that's all I'll say at this point as I encourage you to study this for yourself. The earth is a formless void, and darkness covers the face of the deep while God's Spirit sweeps over the waters. We have this very beautiful and intriguing picture that's designed in the second verse of Genesis. So in day one, God makes light, and he calls a light day, and the darkness he calls night. And so God created from nothing, which is different than made, very different terms in English. The Hebrew term should be translated created. It's as if he made it from nothing. It's not like a potter who takes clay and makes a vase. It's like a potter who creates clay from the very beginning. That is the image you need to see. And by the way in which it's referenced is he speaks. His absolute power lies in his simply the expression of making. There's no physical labor involved here. There's the term that in English says God hovers, implying that something's about to happen as God hovers. And there's obviously a reference to the fact that man doesn't create time. God created time from timelessness. There was timelessness. God is timeless. One writer of the Bible later will say to God, one day is like 1,000 years, 1,000 years is like one day, Solomon will say. God lives outside of time, but God ordered time. He creates time, and he creates time in a weekly cycle. That's a God thing, not a human. Day two, God makes the sky, and he calls the sky heaven. One of the important notes on this issue is that there's a separation here that goes between the heavens, sky, and water. Water, of course, being a very important element for not only mankind, but also animals and vegetation, water. And water occupies a very crucial role in ancient stories in the ancient Near East. Myths. For example, in Egypt, they will assign a certain divinity, the divinity Nun, which is the deification of primordial water abyss. In Mesopotamian myths, there is a god of the salt sea. His name is Tiamat. There's a god of the sweet waters, Apsu, and there's a god of the fresh waters, Mummu. So they split up the divine in a polytheistic world. But the importance of water. Notice how Genesis says God separates the heavens from the waters. Waters are separated from the expanse, which God called heaven. Shemayim. Shemayim, the heavens, is what man sees above himself. In day three, God makes the seas and the dry land, and he calls the land earth. And he also makes plants of every kind. So some things to note very quickly about three. God is the one that gives all names to all the elements set up to this point. Man doesn't exist. Man doesn't name them. Not only man does not create them, he doesn't name them. Now, vegetation seems to be a bit out of place, but what it does is it prepares the world that God's creating for food for humanity and other creatures. Need to have it present when animals and man are placed in them. And by the way, again, as many commentators have noted, the first 3 days are the forming days of creation of God. And then after he has spent 3 days forming things, there is the filling days, and that is how day 4 begins, with the filling. Day 4, God makes the sun for the day and the moon for the night, and he also makes the stars in the sky. Sun and moon. Here's the important thing. Without sun and moon, there is no time. Sun and moon make for time. What's interesting is that man will divide the hours of daylight and the hours of darkness into 12. Some of the first appearances of that division of daylight and nighttime into 12 what we call now hours, is from Mesopotamia. Of course, we have now hours that are 60 minutes and minutes that are 60 seconds. Ancients did not have that. They did not have minutes and seconds. So in ancient times, there was a division of daylight and nighttime into 12, but depending on whether you were in December or in June, daylight, the hours were longer in June, so an hour of daylight could last 75 minutes as opposed to hour 60 now, because the amount of daylight is longer. Say, for example, in June 21st, the longest day of the year, not in the sense of more than 24 hours, but more sunlight the other time. And the opposite, the winter solstice, which is December 21st, that's when the amount of daylight is shortest, so that the hours of darkness are longer and the hours of daylight are shorter. They divided time by 12. Modern day time, we make them all equal by using the 60, number 60, that we have placed on the division of ancient cultures of 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of sunlight. But the point is, God created time when he created sun and moon. So from the very beginning, there's a deliberate undermining, just going against the grain of pagan ideas that nature is governed and everything in it by all these scattered and diverse and at war with each other deities that you will see in the mythologies of ancient cultures. God made, the term in Hebrew, asa, the two great lights. He fashioned them, these two important parts of the making the world, earth, inhabitable to not only animals, but also and insects and vegetation, but also to, and most importantly, mankind. Day 5, God makes fish and other creatures of the sea. He makes birds of the air as well. So he populates the heavens, the sky, and the waters, and the earth that he has just created. Interesting things there is that in the Hebrew, the word tanin is used, which in general refers to great sea creatures. Some other refer to, if you can look it up, to the word tanin as sea monsters, which may mean that they were both water and land, or amphibious. But the term can be used for large serpents, can be used for crocodiles, and some would even ask the question, can these be, in the day 5, the dinosaurs that modern day science seems so assuredly to place 65 million years ago. And by the way, the word dragon is sometimes used to reference Tanin as well. Just a quick invitation to, without learning Hebrew, to look at these interesting Hebrew words that are referenced here in the creation story of Genesis 1. But of course, day 6 is the most important one. God makes animals of the land, and then he creates the pinnacle of his creation, man and woman, in his image and likeness. Day 6 is the peak of creation. It is also the largest section of the story given to a particular day. There is implied and stated a significant distinction between living creatures on the dry land and human beings. Human beings are not just an evolved animal living creature. That's clearly implied by the creation story. Verse 26 of the chapter gives absolutely assigned special status assigned to humans. There is an interesting also plural, us, that's referenced in verse 26. While I suggested that angels may already be existing, they have not shown up or participated in the creation, and men are not in the form of angels. And so this us that pops up in this verse, some say is the first hint of something that is never, the word is never used in the Bible, but it's implied all the way through, that God is three persons in one, or the word is Trinity, as it is discussed from a theological point of view and has been for a long time. The Bible implies God is one, but is three in one, Trinity. And that is, of course, a very deep subject that needs to be addressed more seriously in a different setting. Verse 27 says man is formed in the image of God. Again, no other creature or creation is referenced like that. Man is endowed with authority, different than others, and the fact that male and female are created speaks of relationship, speaks of marriage. That is all themes that are coming out of the way in which day 6 is narrated. 7, God rests. He blesses the seventh day and makes it holy. So God completes the process of ordering creation. Creation is not this chaotic and accidental. It's absolutely the opposite as described in Genesis. It is absolutely every aspect controlled, millimetrical, every detail is created intentionally by God. The importance of 7 comes out of this, and the importance of rest. 7, Shabbat. 7 is one of the oldest words in mankind. It's not only ancient Hebrew, but it goes possibly beyond that. The number 7 is extremely important, and the concept of rest. Both of these, 7 and rest, are a God thing, as Genesis puts it. God's rest hints at the purpose of his creation. God doesn't need rest, but he rests as a model or an example, and rest is associated with worship and taking time off, focusing on the important thing, temple building, even say some. So the earth that he has just created for man is intended not just as the dwelling place of man, but the dwelling place of God. It's like a divine sanctuary. And that is an important point that some scholars point out. There are some words that are there in chapter 2 and verse 1 with regard to the creative act of God in Genesis. It is finished, which is a very interesting set of words. It's translated in English as 3, but it is something that are the last words of Jesus on the cross. Right before his last breath, he says, "It is finished." Interesting parallel with God the Father as he finishes his work of creation. By the way, the seventh day is the only one that's not marked by the words morning and evening. So here's a quick look at the first 11 chapters. Adam and Eve are referenced in chapter 2 and 3. Then the stories, of course, of Cain and his brother, chapter 4. Then there's the story of Adam to Noah. Then from Noah and the ark and the flood. And then there's the covenant that's made with Noah by God. And then there are descendants of Noah. Then there's the story of Tower of Babel. And then the genealogies from one of the sons of Noah to Abraham, which will begin our next chapter in your textbook. Chapter 2 of Genesis is kind of like a literary flashback. God, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, it talks about the creation of man, but then as chapter 2 begins, it kind of flashes back to that point and provides more detail and gives more space to the culminating act of God of creation of man and woman. The sovereign God of the creation of the universe and the world is complemented by a personal and immanent God that gets personal. And this is a very important point. The Garden of Eden is referenced in this chapter, chapter 2. God creates Adam out of the dust of the ground. The term that is, the Hebrew term that is translated is he breathed life. It's the only time in the creative act where God breathes life, and that implies physical, mental, spiritual. Unlike the animals, God breathes life into man. Man's relationship to the earth is implied by the fact that God took earth, clay, and formed kind of like a potter. And one other quick note that I'll make to that is, by the way, that there's no rain referenced at all in the story of the creation. There's mist only on the face of the earth, but rain will appear when the flood happens in chapter 6, and that's the first time you're going to see it. So mist is what there was before, until there is the a necessary punishment of God of a wicked mankind, which begins in Genesis chapter 6. There are 2 trees in the garden that are special, the tree of life and in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One might wonder why these 2, but of course as the story plays out, you see the purpose of it. God tells man that he can eat from any tree except for these 2. Make sure you is clear why these 2 might be important. As I've said, Eden is not a mythological place, it's a geographical place. Now, again, also what's interesting about that is that if Mesopotamia, Iraq, was one of the borders of that great lush garden, well, that lush garden is now mostly desert in our time. That's one of the interesting parallels of our time. In that garden, Adam is not placed there just to sit on a couch and click channels. He's there to work. He's there to keep it. So there's a assignment. He is supposed to work it. And so there is an implied activity that man has within that. Eve is created, but it is Adam that first names the animals. God actually brings them to him, and he names them. God names everything else before that, but Adam names the animals. God sees that Adam is alone and needs a suitable helper, and so he forms Eve, or forms woman, so to speak. And of course, as you well know, the creation story of Genesis says that she came from one of Adam's ribs. Interesting questions that some scholars ask about this particular detail. And of course, a reminder to you that there's a reference to man leaving his father in the narrative of forming of families and special relationship of husband and wife and marriage that's referenced as well in these beginning chapters. Marriage is a God thing. Man-woman relationship is a God thing. It's the first human relationship. It was totally a creation of God. It's not a creation of American culture, um, um, Hebrew culture, or any other culture. There is no culture at this time in the Garden of Eden. There's only Adam and Eve, and it is God who creates marriage. They are naked, but they're not ashamed. There is no sin, and there is no shame. That's an interesting um, uh, reference to our time that is made obvious by this description of the unashamed nakedness of Adam and Eve. Didn't have clothing, didn't need it either. Interesting proposition. The fall, of course, there is brought on by a speaking, interesting, crafty serpent that just pops up on the scene seemingly out of nowhere. It is a very ambiguous creature. Later, the serpent is clearly God's enemy. He has a knack at deliberately misquoting God, saying part of what God does, but turning words around. The woman echoes God, but with slight modifications, modifies his instructions a bit. The serpent then dares to directly contradict God, and the irony of this scene here of a talking serpent and a man and a woman is that the man and a woman is seen as in the image of God, while the snake, of course, entails a very different and opposite image, so to speak, than the man and woman. Man and woman, of course, choose one at a time to obey the serpent and not God, and they disobey, they betray the trust that God gives them, and that is treachery. It is both disobedience which leads to treachery, treason. They betray the divine and obey instead one of his creatures, the serpent, the crafty and lying serpent. Sorry. The serpent is, again, deceitful in that he speaks half-truths. He also promises a lot, which he cannot deliver. And that's one of the characteristics you see of them. When he says, you will surely not die, well, he's lying about that. Because if he had been truthful about it, then we would not know the amount of time that Adam will live out his life, which is 930 years. He lies. He's the father of lies, who would be described later on in the Bible. As soon as Adam and Eve eat of that fruit, their eyes are opened, but the only thing they see is their nakedness, and their nakedness is a symptom of something deeper, something worse. Now, God does say, become like one of us, knowing good and evil. But that knowledge, by experience, also brings with it, when they eat the fruit, guilt. They feel guilty. They are guilty of disobedience and treachery, and they become now obedient or slaves to evil, that to the route which the serpent has chosen in this case. And of course, then consequences come. They are expelled from the garden. They are separated from the presence of God. Before that, they would walk the coolness of the evening with God, and instead now they can no longer take those walks. They're cut off from the tree of life, and therefore they are destined to live in the realm of decay and death. The fall and the story, as the way Genesis narrates it, reveals the discontent of man with just the permitted tree. We are creatures that want more. We want that which we're told we shouldn't have. We have 500 trees, but we want the 2 that we're told not to touch. There's always, of course, that deadly desire of man to be to know something, to be wise. That and it's a deadly appeal. The snake promises that, and we buy it. Man, of course, will blame woman when we do make the wrong choices. We try to find scapegoats. Men blame woman. The woman blames the serpent. But ultimately, of course, they are both responsible and had a choice from the very beginning. Some say, is this just a mistake? No. Yes, it is a mistake. It is a mistake with disastrous consequences. But I guess we tend to view that as something that should be, easily just dismissed, overlooked. But of course, there are consequences that are dramatic, in this particular case, for dramatic choices. The eating of those fruits transform them, but they don't become better. They attempt to cover their nakedness. And when they are aware of the Lord's presence, then they attempt to hide. Why would they need to hide? Why would they need to cover their nakedness? Sin has brought on a different view of themselves. God doesn't need to know where they are. When he says, where are you? He's simply confronting Adam first as head of the husband-wife relationship, the first human being formed. He addresses him first. When God pronounces the curses, the punishment, he addresses the serpent first, who's now called cursed. It's interesting that in the Hebrew language, when the serpent is introduced, he's called crafty, arum. But then when he's punished by God, he is arur, which is cursed. That may be an intentional in the Hebrew language in the way Moses describes it. There is now contempt, not only from humans, but of course always from God, for the snake, who now is going to have to crawl on his belly in the dust. There's going to be eternal hostility between snakes and a woman's offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. The woman is referenced here, and the term woman meaning mother of all living things, mother of life. She is her punishment is she will suffer pain in childbirth, and it kind of is, some point out that kind of strikes at the heart of the distinctiveness of woman. A woman is the one that can give birth to a human being, and it is there in that great moment of creating life that disobedience, the cost of disobedience, we're reminded of it in that particular instance. She's going to also struggle in her relationship with her husband. That's one of the consequences of her rebellion. That is, there's going to be a tussle in the leadership roles and complementary roles that they're supposed to have, that were designed by God that way. That relationship between husband and wife and husband, is damaged by sin, distorted by sin, and that we definitely see in our day as well as in ancient times. Man is going to tend to want to domineer woman, while woman is going to tend to usurp a leadership role. That is, of course, a factor that is clearly evident in contemporary society. Adam will have to, his punishment, he will not only not have a perfect relationship with his wife, but he will have to work accursed ground. It's before he was simply a manager, a supervisor. Now he's going to have to do it all by himself, which involves the ground from which he was formed. One of the ironies there. He ate the prohibited fruit, so now he's going to have to struggle to eat. Before it was just simple, reaching out and grabbing, but he ate the wrong fruit, the prohibited one. So now he's going to have to struggle to make a living and work hard. God says that because of Adam and Eve's sin, people are going to die. I'm not going to address the purified earth theory. I'm going to let it go for now because it'll take us to depth, and this lecture is long enough. Let me bring us as quickly as possible to a conclusion. There are two other consequences to the fall of Genesis, narrated in Genesis 3. The man does here name his wife. She is called woman before, life giver. Eve, the mother of the living, is the term he names his wife. And God then provides better clothing for Adam and Eve. That's embedded in an important detail, maybe, of the narrative. Just a quick comment here that if God provided the clothing here, well, then this is the first death of an animal, because animal skin is going to require the death of an animal here when God provides clothing for Adam and Eve. Some want to point out that this is a possible parallel to later animal sacrifice, or some even to the death of Christ, but that may be a stretch. God says you can no longer live in the garden. He cast them out of Eden, and one of the types of angels, cherubim, is placed with a flaming sword, here fire in the image of a sword, to keep them from the entrance to the garden. So a cherubim, in a sense, replaces Adam in keeping and guarding Eden. Adam loses his job. And that is one of the consequences. And in a sense, they both lose their jobs because sin, their disobedience, prevents the couple from fulfilling the role that God had in mind, the duty of taking care, living with him and caring for the Garden of Eden. So, the fall, the expulsion, one of the beautiful frescoes of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel that you're looking at here, is followed by more bad stuff, as we saw. Chapter 4 plunges us into the further sin, that is the murder, the first murder in history. There is maybe hope that Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, might reverse the trend of rebellion. Instead, that is dashed. Another figure that appears in these chapters of Genesis, Lamech, will actually do more than just kill. He will boast in killing. That's in a later chapter, a descendant of Cain. Adam and Eve are allowed to conceive not only Cain and Abel, but also after them another son, Seth. And obviously there are more, because there are going to be wives that Cain has and Seth have. The reminder to you of the background of the first murder, Abel offers the best of his flock, and God sees this favorably. Again, the emphasis should not be on the fact that God loves sheep, a flock, and he doesn't like what Cain offers him. It's the intent of the heart that matters. Abel has faith, while Cain knows that God exists. He's a monotheist, but his heart is not into his offering, and there's a problem with his heart. He offers some of his crop And it's not the crop that's the problem that God doesn't accept. It's what they reflect. And then he gets angry when God does not accept his offering. He is given a chance to do better and take it. God confronts Cain. Cain responds with famous words, "Am I my brother's keeper?" which is tragic and ironic. He is not only not remorseful of what he did, he is, in a sense, mocking God, as if God does not know what happened and where the body of Abel is. No sign of remorse whatsoever. Just absolutely tragic words. Am I my brother's keeper? The answer to that is yes, you are. But Cain denies that responsibility. God curses Cain, casts him away to a land of Nod. We shouldn't assume that's a fictional land just because we don't know exactly where it is, but it's the punishment is linked to the crime. Uh, Human sin has bearing on fertility of soil. The more there is sin, the harder the ground is, and the more man has to work it. Cain's going to be further alienated from God. He's further alienated from the earth that's supposed to provide sustenance for him. He's further alienated from other men. He's a fugitive. We don't know who the other men are, but they must be other sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, are descendants of Seth. And God gives him a mark so that he will live out his life with guilt. I have to assume that Cain always had an opportunity to repent, but there's no evidence that he ever did. Quickly moving on, Cain takes a wife. It must be again one of his sisters. There is then a reference to city building that's mentioned in particular after one of the descendants of Cain, one by the name of Enoch, Cain's son. Lamech is another figure that appears, and he's 5 generations later, and he boasts not just of killing and revenge, but also of 77-fold revenge. So just out of proportion violence. So the propensity towards violence in the descendants of Cain just magnifies. He's like his ancestor, but a lot worse. There are other cultural developments that appear in the book of Genesis in these chapters. Animal breeding, the appearance of music. God creates music. It's one of the talents, passions, abilities. Metalworking. All of these appear in the narrative. Here is a quick reference, and I'll go ahead and put all of these names that tie the first man to Genesis 6 and the flood of Noah. Please just simply look at the numbers associated of length of lives. Adam 930, Seth 912, and please notice that the numbers here are in the hundreds, 7, 800, 900. The only one to be an exception to this is Enoch, and he did not die. He's one of 2 figures in the Bible that are said to have been taken directly by God into the heavens, skipping death in a sense, and so this happens to him, you could say, early on in his life at the age of 365. But notice, please, the longevity of these figures before Noah, before the great flood. And what I will point out then is how these big numbers from 900 to 800 to 700, they significantly decrease after the flood. So Noah, chapter 6 is his story. We are introduced to a tragic worldwide picture of increasing human wickedness. God has had enough. Things are not getting better, they're getting exponentially worse. So God decides to destroy all living things with a gigantic global flood. But Noah does find favor in the sight of the Lord, and so God commands him to be able to survive this gigantic flood, to build a big boat, an ark. The ark is going to protect Noah, his family of 2 sons, his wife and his 2 sons, and his 3 sons and their daughters, so a total of 8. And 2 or 7 of every living creature that exists will be preserved in this ark as well. And God gets very specific, incredibly specific instructions on how to build an ark that's going to survive this gigantic flood. Um, um, the artistic renderings that you're going to see are to kind of give you an idea of it. Specific size, specific type of wood to be used, incredibly specific is, I guess, highlight here the instructions about the ark. Made out of gopher wood or cypress, which implies don't use any other wood. There are going to be rooms inside for the various animals. It's going to need to be covered with pitch inside and out to prevent leakage. The specific dimensions are going to be, and you can see it in feet or meters, translating the old ancient terms that are used, cubits, so you can see their size. Just so you understand the dimensions of this ark as given in the book of Genesis, it is 450 feet in length, or which is a time and a half the size of a football or soccer field, which is around 90 meters or 100 yards, to speak. Again, as a term of reference, if you're looking at the width of the ark and its specific dimensions, it's about a little wider than a semi today. You're going to need to put a window in it. It's going to be exactly a certain distance from the top. There's going to be a door, single door on the side of the ark. It's going to have 3 decks. So you're looking at, in a sense, again, that our description of this ark. You're going to bring 7 of every, and again, animals are divided in clean and unclean. And we're going to have to make reference to that term later on in Jewish terminology. 7 of every clean animal, 2 of every unclean animal, 7 of every bird, and enough food to feed a family and all of these animals within the ark. This is one of the beautiful portrayals in art history by a Dutch painter, Bruegel, from the early 17th century of picture. So he enters the ark. He enters, it takes him from the time when he starts warning the people of his time around the age of 500. It'll take about 100 years to build and endure the ridicule of his contemporaries who thinks he's nuts or crazy. But he enters the ark on when he's 600 years old on the 17th day of the 2nd month, and once inside, God puts them in, and then God erupts the underground torrents, the windows of the heavens, so the water comes from below, from above, and the rain falls on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, that number. And then the waters in all their immenseness are going to cover the whole earth, including the largest peaks of the earth, for a period of 150 days. And even the tallest of mountains, nowadays Mount Everest is said to be the tallest mountains, but I don't know what was the tallest mountain back when this global flood took place. But even the tallest mountain on the face of the earth was covered up to a space 7 meters of flowing waters. That's because the ark is going to be have a displacement in the water, and so it's going to need not to crash into these peaks in its voyage. And it's floating on the waters. So there's a space even above the highest of the peaks described. So after 150 days, God causes the waters to subside, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark comes to rest, finally, as the waters start to recede on a specific mountain. Ararat, as it's called. So, artistic image of the landing on Mount Ararat. Now, there is a Mount Ararat in our modern day geography today. You're looking at a picture of ancient lands, but in modern day, it's in Turkey. So look at the top of this map you're looking at. At the top, you'll see Mount Ararat right here. And it is right as the yellow is about to expire at the top middle of your map. That is a mountain in southeast part of Turkey that is still carries that name. We do not know for sure if that is the Mount Ararat that is described in the Bible, but it does have glaciers, interestingly enough, in this area. Some want to still try to find Noah's Ark in the glaciers of that mountain, but that is probably a futile search, only because I doubt God wants us to find it, even if it is still preserved from those times. So there is that map, just so you know what some wish to find in southeast. This is where Mount Ararat is, again in southeast Turkey, right on the border with Armenia and with modern day countries of Iraq to the south. There it is right there. So, on the first day of the 10th month, on the top of the mountains begin to appear as they continue to recede. And after 40 days, Noah sends out a raven. Noah also sends out a dove, but it comes back. After 7 days, Noah sends out the dove again, and it comes back with an olive leaf, meaning that it has landed on an olive tree and has therefore vegetation has returned, and so it's safe for Noah and his family to exit from the ark and be on land again. There are another 7 days that pass again. Noah sends out the dove again and return. On the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, Noah removes the covering of the ark to reveal the dry ground. On the 27th day of the second month, over a year since the flood began, Noah and the animals then finally exit officially the ark. First act of Noah in this new start, it's like a restart to the world, is that Noah builds an altar and offers it up to sacrifice to the Lord. God blesses Noah and establishes his covenant with him and his descendants. And of course, the origin of the rainbow is described as a sign of a promise of God. I'm never going to use this way to destroy mankind again. God promises that, and he signifies it by giving a beautiful rainbow, which of course appears quite often when you see rays of sunshine through the rain, and so is a beautiful reminder of the promise of God to this day. God tells Noah and his family that they need to care for the earth, and then tells Noah that the punishment for murdering other humans is death. Murder, again, is defined as killing of innocent people. That is the spilling of human blood. Innocent human blood is not according to the word of God. Everyone speaks one language. It's clear, and the people settle in the land of Shinar. We're coming now to chapter 11, the last chapter of this a more in-depth survey of the first 11 chapters. There is now, again, a city building, and however, in this city that appears in the aftermath of the flood, built by descendants of Noah, there is, again, tragically, rebellion, pride, and a sense of autonomy that leads to wanting to defy God. The city that we find here is an antithesis of God's will. In one of the ancient other works of ancient times, accounts of ancient cultures, the Eridu Genesis, from the city found in the library of the city of Nineveh, the Assyrians. There's a myth of a goddess, Nintur, that is calling on humanity to build cities. What's interesting is, of course, that in this Genesis narrative, there is city building, and then there is city identification. In this city, there is a seeking of independence, autonomy, self-sufficiency from the divine. There is embedded in the story of the Tower of Babel that we find in chapter 11, the talents of abilities by use of technology and social unity, what groups of men can do when they put their minds to it, which is a good thing. Think, for example, of the pyramids, massive tombs to one man that are 480 feet up in the air, just examples of the incredible skill and technology of ancient mankind. Those giant pyramids in the Giza Plateau are from 4,500 years ago, from around 25th century before Christ. Before that is this detail of this construction of the Tower of Babel. And it does speak of man's abilities when he works together with his talents and abilities to do great things. But it's also a sign of again, aspirations and ultimately then pride. Babel is related to the word Balal, which means to confuse, to mix, to mingle. In Babylon, which is where we think the Tower of Babel was, symbolizes the ambition of man to reach God, be God, dethrone God, and make earth his own. The tendency of man to build high things to the heavens. Now, I will go ahead and just reference the fact that today's skyscrapers are maybe not that, in the sense that they are there because there's limited space within a urban structure, and so going up is the only way you can go when you gotta have a company or a business, and you need many floors to do that. But in ancient culture, it is definitely an attempt to reach the heavens and to reach the divine. Here is a map again with an arrow pointing to the presence of the possibly Tower of Babel, question mark, please see, in the land between the rivers of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, around where the city of Babylon will be later. So, chapter 11, to conclude, the people decide to build a city and a tower with its top to reach the heavens. The Lord comes to see the tower they are building and thinks there is nothing they cannot do, so he confuses their languages. And since they cannot understand each other, the people are scattered over the whole earth, and the city they had built is called. So, this is an artistic representation by another Dutch painter of the 16th century, Bruegel, that is again just an artistic representation, and the map of where that Tower of Babel might have been. And once men were confused because they could not understand each other, speaking various languages, they scatter out to that part of the world. And this is a reference to it. In a last slide here, I want to simply show the line that connects Noah and his one of his sons, Shem, and then, of course, down through time to where we're going to pick up in chapter 12 with the founder of the Hebrew people, of Hebrew nation, Abram or Abraham. One thing I'll have you note as we look at the names and numbers of years they lived of these figures, patriarchal figures before Abraham, notice please that after the flood, the ages of man start shortening from Noah 950 to Shem to Arphaxad. You come from 950 down to the amount of years that the father of Abraham, Terah, will live, 205, and the number that Abraham. So in the post-flood period, there is a decreasing longevity of the human kind. This concludes the material that will be on chapter exam number 1. Thank you for listening to a long lecture.